If your survival depends on a system, you're already dead, the instructor said, and the room went quiet before anyone understood why. The lecture hall of the Galactic Academy hummed with soft blue light and filtered air at exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Rows of alien students sat in polished exosuits that adjusted pressure, oxygen, and temperature automatically, their displays flickering with biometric perfection, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, hands empty, posture relaxed, wearing nothing but a standard-issue human field jacket. No visible tech, no interface, no protection. Lyra Vexis watched him from the second row, her iridescent blue skin catching the overhead light as her eyes narrowed slightly. She had read every file on humans, categorized them as resilient but inefficient, adaptable but primitive, a species that compensated for biological weakness with reckless behavior. And yet this one stood there like the room belonged to him. You're here to learn. Survival. Ethan continued, his voice low, almost conversational, forcing the translation systems to lean in. But most of you don't understand what that word means. A few students shifted, faint amusement rippling through the chamber. One of them whispered something about Deathworld theatrics. Lyra didn't laugh, but she didn't disagree either. Her data suggested humans exaggerated danger as a cultural trait. Ethan's gaze moved across the room, not scanning, not analyzing, just seeing, and when his eyes passed over Lyra, she felt something unfamiliar, like being measured without a tool. Today's lesson is simple, he said, reaching toward the central console. You will rely on your systems. A pause, just long enough, and then you won't. The simulation chamber activated with a low mechanical hum, walls dissolving into a vast horizon of scorched desert. The temperature rose incrementally, 80, 95, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind began to howl, carrying fine particles that tapped against armor like static rain. The students remained calm, their suits compensating instantly. Oxygen levels steady, hydration regulated, heart rates optimal. Lyra monitored her display with quiet confidence. Everything was within acceptable parameters, exactly as designed, exactly as predicted. Ethan stepped forward into the projection field, boots crunching against synthetic sand that felt real enough to register on every sensor. Stay within safety guidelines, announced the system in 12 languages, a familiar reassurance, a constant across every training module. Lyra exhaled slowly. This was routine, controlled, safe. Ethan didn't respond to the announcement, didn't even glance at the indicators hovering in the air. He just kept walking, deeper into the heat distortion, until the light bent around him and the wind swallowed his outline. Lyra frowned. Her interface flagged a minor anomaly, a flicker, a delay in environmental correction, barely measurable, probably a calibration issue. She dismissed it until the first warning tone sounded, soft, almost polite. Oxygen regulation fluctuation. Her display blinked once, then stabilized. Around her, a few students exchanged looks. Nothing serious, systems self-corrected all the time. Ethan's voice came through the comms, calm, unhurried. Tell me when it stops being comfortable. Lyra opened her mouth to answer, to explain that discomfort was irrelevant when systems functioned perfectly. But before she could speak, the second warning hit, louder this time, sharper, and the temperature climbed another 10 degrees without adjustment. The wind intensified, pushing harder, grains of sand striking with increasing force. Her suit compensated, then hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Lyra's eyes narrowed. That wasn't in the parameters. She checked her readings again, and for the first time since the simulation began, something didn't match. And somewhere ahead, barely visible through the distortion, the human kept walking as if nothing had changed at all. The third warning did not sound polite. It tore through the chamber like a mechanical scream, and this time the numbers did not stabilize. Lyra's oxygen indicator dipped by 2% and held there, unmoving. Her breath caught halfway as her system recalibrated, then tried again, and failed. Around her the others began speaking over one another in tight, controlled voices that were no longer fully controlled. System delay, one said. Minor fluctuation, said another. But the wind outside intensified, pressing against their suits with a force that felt increasingly real. Grains of sand striking faster now, harder. The temperature climbing past 120 degrees Fahrenheit with no correction. Lyra tapped her wrist interface, forcing a manual override. The response came half a second too late. That half second lingered, stretched. Wrong. Instructor, she called, her voice sharper than before. The system is not maintaining environmental stability. Her words translated cleanly, but carried a tone that did not belong in a controlled simulation. Ethan's voice returned through the comms, still calm, still steady. Correct. Just that. No urgency. No explanation. Lyra's eyes flicked toward the horizon, searching for him through the heat distortion. She could barely make out his silhouette now, a figure moving deeper into conditions her system was actively failing to regulate, requesting reset. Another student said, louder this time, request denied. The system replied instantly, and that was when the room truly changed, not because of the denial, but because it came from the system and not from the instructor. Lyra felt it then, a subtle shift in control, like gravity adjusting by a fraction. The kind of change you do not notice until your balance is gone. Her oxygen dipped again, 3% this time. The internal temperature of her suit rose by 2 degrees and did not drop back. She swallowed. The air inside her helmet felt thinner, not immediately dangerous, but no longer guaranteed. This is outside safety parameters, Lyra said, forcing her voice to remain level. Affirmative, Ethan replied. And there was something in that single word that unsettled her more than the failing systems. He was not correcting it. He was confirming it. A student to her left took a step back, then another, as if distance could restore control. We need to return to the safe zone, he said, pointing behind them where the horizon shimmered differently, a faint boundary line where the simulation should have remained. Stable, Lyra glanced at her map. The boundary existed, but the data around it flickered. Inconsistent, unreliable. She hesitated for the first time, not because she did not know what to do, but because the system that told her what to do was no longer certain. Move, she said finally, taking a step toward the boundary. Her suit compensated for the shift, then lagged again. The delay longer now, nearly a full second. Each movement required adjustment, calculation, awareness, things the system usually handled without thought. The others followed. Their movements less coordinated, less precise, the environment pressing harder with every step, the wind louder, the heat heavier. Lyra's breathing slowed deliberately as she forced control over something she had never needed to control before, her own body. Instructor, you are exceeding operational guidelines, she said, eyes fixed on the distant figure. Ethan stopped walking, just for a moment, then turned slightly, enough for his voice to carry back through the storm. There are no guidelines out here, he said. And then he kept walking, and for the first time since she had entered the academy, Lyra Vexis realized she did not understand the lesson she was in. The boundary did not feel safe when they reached it. It felt like a suggestion that no longer applied. Lyra slowed as the line shimmered in front of her, her display marking it as stable zone while every other indicator flickered with inconsistency. She stepped across and waited for the correction, for the cooling systems to normalize, for the oxygen to rise back to optimal levels. But the numbers held where they were, slightly off, stubbornly imperfect, and behind her the others stopped as well, confusion spreading in tight, controlled movements that were beginning to look less controlled with each passing second. This is the safe zone, one of them said, as if repeating it would make it true. Lyra checked again. Her system confirmed it. But her body disagreed. The air still felt thin. The heat still pressed against her skin through layers of engineered protection. Why is it not correcting? Another voice asked, quieter now. Less certain, Lyra did not answer. Because she did not know, and that absence of an answer settled heavier than the heat itself. She turned back toward the storm, searching for Ethan, and found him further away than before, still moving, still unprotected. A figure that should have been struggling, should have been compensating, should have been reacting, but was not. He moved with the same steady pace as before, unaffected by the rising temperature, the failing systems, the shifting parameters. Instructor, Lyra called again, her voice carrying a tension she could no longer hide. The safe zone is not restoring system stability. There was a pause before his reply, not long, but long enough to be noticed. Then it is not safe, he said, And the simplicity of that answer landed harder than any alarm. Lyra felt something shift inside her understanding. A fracture forming where certainty used to be. She looked at her interface again, at the numbers she had trusted without question, and for the first time she considered the possibility that they were not wrong, just irrelevant. A student behind her took a deeper breath than necessary. The sound amplified inside the helmet, uneven, human-like in its lack of precision. "We need assistance," he said, not to Ethan, but to the system itself, requesting external support. The system responded immediately. "No support available." The words echoed through the comms with clinical indifference. Lyra's pulse increased by a measurable margin. Her display highlighted it. In soft amber, a warning, not critical, but no longer ideal. She forced her breathing to slow again, consciously this time, controlling each inhale and exhale without relying on automated regulation. It felt inefficient, imprecise, but it worked, barely. She glanced at the others, saw the same realization beginning to form, small adjustments, manual control, awareness replacing automation. "Instructor," she said again, quieter now, more focused. "What is the objective of this exercise?" The wind carried his answer back in fragments, but the translation filled the gaps. "To notice," he said, and that was all. Lyra frowned slightly. The word too vague, too incomplete, and yet it lingered. She looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor that had not been there before, at the delayed response of her suit, at the environment that no longer aligned with expectation, and she began to notice everything. The weight of the air, the timing of her breath, the way each step required intention instead of assumption. And when she looked up again, Ethan had stopped walking completely, standing in the distance as if waiting, not for the system to recover, but for them to understand something it never could. The wind did not ease when they stopped. It pressed harder, as if waiting for them to make a mistake. Lyra took another breath, slower this time, counting the seconds without relying on the display that now flickered between numbers she no longer trusted. 1 second in, 2 seconds hold, 3 seconds out. The air still felt thin, but it moved, and that was enough. Around her the others began to imitate the same pattern, uneven at first, then gradually more controlled, their movements less dependent on the failing systems and more on something they had rarely used before, awareness. "Maintain spacing," Lyra said, her voice steadier now, not because the situation had improved, but because she had accepted that it would not. The group adjusted instinctively, forming a loose line instead of clustering near the boundary that promised safety but delivered nothing. One of the students glanced back at the shimmering line, then forward at the endless desert, and chose forward. The decision small, but irreversible. Lyra noticed it, and understood that something had changed, not in the environment, but in them. She lifted her hand slightly, feeling the resistance of the wind, measuring it not through sensors but through sensation, the direction, the force, the rhythm of the gusts. It was inconsistent, but not random. There was a pattern, subtle, shifting, but real. "Move with the wind, not against it," she said, and this time no one questioned her. They adjusted their steps, angling slightly, reducing the force pressing against them. The difference was minimal, but noticeable. A fraction less strain, a fraction more control. Lyra's display lagged again, her hydration level dropped by a small percentage. The alert blinked, then froze. She ignored it, focusing instead on the dryness in her throat, the way her breathing needed to adapt. Smaller breaths, more frequent, controlled. She had read about this in human physiology reports, adaptations to low-resource environments, inefficient by design standards, but effective. Ethan had not moved from his position in the distance, his silhouette steady against the distortion, watching, not intervening, not correcting, just observing. Lyra felt a brief flicker of frustration at that, then realized it was not directed at him, but at the absence of guidance she had always relied on. "Instructor," she called, not expecting an answer, but needing to test the connection. His voice came through, quieter now, almost lost in the wind. "Yes." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, choosing her words carefully. "If the system cannot be trusted, what replaces it?" There was a pause, longer this time, filled only by the sound of wind and controlled breathing. Then his answer arrived, simple, unadorned. "You do." Lyra closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to feel the environment without visual data, the heat against her skin, the pressure of the air, the timing of her breath, the position of her body in space. When she opened them again, the display still flickered, still unreliable, but it no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a distraction she could choose to ignore. "We keep moving," she said, not to Ethan, but to the others, and this time her voice carried something new, not authority granted by rank or data, but confidence built in real time. They followed, step by step, not perfectly, not efficiently, but deliberately, and as they moved away from the false boundary and deeper into the environment that had stopped pretending to be safe, Lyra realized that the lesson had already begun long before any of them noticed. And the only reason they were still standing was not because the system had failed, but because they were finally starting to replace it. The rhythm of their movement changed before anyone spoke about it. Each step less reactive, more deliberate. Lyra felt it first in her balance, the way her body adjusted before her display could catch up, the delay still there, but no longer leading. She lifted her gaze toward the horizon and realized something else had shifted. The storm was not uniform. It moved in layers, currents within currents. The wind that struck them was only part of it. Above, the air twisted in slower arcs, subtle but predictable if you watched long enough. "There," she said, pointing slightly to the right. "Follow that line." The others looked, unsure at first, then saw it, a faint distortion in the distance where the sand moved differently. They adjusted course, and almost immediately the pressure against them eased by a small but measurable margin. Not enough to be called safe, but enough to matter. One of the students exhaled sharply, not in panic, but in realization. "It is manageable," he said, as if testing the word. Lyra nodded once, her focus already shifting to the next variable. Her suit temperature rose another degree, then held. The warning light blinked again, slower now, as if even the system was struggling to keep up with conditions it no longer controlled. She ignored it, placing her hand briefly against the outer layer of her suit, feeling the heat transfer, gauging it directly. The surface was hot, but not immediately overwhelming. She adjusted her breathing again, shorter inhales, longer exhales, conserving what little efficiency remained. Behind her, one of the students stumbled, not falling, but losing alignment with the group. Lyra turned instantly, her reaction faster than any system prompt. "Stay with the pattern," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "Match the steps, do not fight it." The student corrected, his movements syncing with the others, and the instability passed, small, but dangerous if ignored. Lyra turned forward again, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tracked Ethan's position. He had not moved much, but the distance between them had changed, not because he came closer, but because they were finally moving in a way that closed the gap, step by step, choice by choice. He watched them, not with approval, not with concern, just with attention, as if measuring something that did not exist on any display. "Instructor," Lyra called, her voice steadier now, no longer asking for answers, but acknowledging his presence. "We are adapting." The response came after a moment, carried through the wind in that same calm tone. "You are noticing." He corrected. Lyra felt a brief flicker of something she had not expected, not disagreement, but recognition. The distinction mattered. Adaptation implied reaction. Noticing implied awareness before reaction. She adjusted her pace slightly, testing the difference, anticipating the next shift in the wind instead of responding to it. The result was subtle, but undeniable. Less resistance, less strain, more control. She almost smiled, but the expression did not fully form. Not yet. The environment still demanded everything she had. But for the first time since the systems failed, she did not feel like she was losing control. She felt like she was gaining something else, something the system had never provided. And as they moved deeper into the desert that had stopped pretending to protect them, Lyra understood that the lesson was no longer about survival conditions. It was about the space between input and response, the moment where a choice could exist, and ahead of them, the human who never needed that lesson stood waiting, not as a guide, but as proof. The distance between them and Ethan closed slowly, not because the environment softened, but because their movement had finally aligned with it. Lyra could feel the difference in every step, The strain that once came from resistance now replaced by a careful negotiation with the wind. She adjusted her angle again, just a few degrees, and the pressure across her suit dropped slightly, enough to conserve energy, enough to matter. Behind her the others followed without hesitation, no longer waiting for system prompts that never came. Their breathing audible through the comms, uneven but controlled, each inhale chosen, each exhale measured. Lyra's display flickered again, oxygen levels dipping to a point that would have triggered immediate intervention in any controlled environment. But no intervention came, and more importantly, none was expected. Anymore, she lowered her gaze briefly, watching the way the sand shifted under her steps, noticing how certain patches held firmer while others slid, subtle differences that no sensor had highlighted, patterns that only appeared when she stopped expecting them to be labeled. "Adjust your footing," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Do not trust the surface, test it." One of the students mimicked her movement, pressing slightly before committing weight, and found stability where before there had been none. Small corrections, repeated, becoming instinct faster than she thought possible. Ethan remained ahead, still and patient, his silhouette no longer distant but not yet close, as if he existed exactly where they needed him to be, no more, no less. "Instructor," Lyra called again, this time not out of uncertainty, but to anchor the moment. "We are maintaining function without system support." The response came almost immediately, carried through the thinning air. "You are maintaining yourselves," he said, and the distinction settled into her understanding with quiet precision. She glanced at her display one more time. The numbers still inconsistent, still unreliable, but no longer commanding her attention. She turned it off completely, the interface fading from her vision, leaving only the environment, the sound of wind, the weight of heat, the rhythm of her breath. For a brief moment, there was nothing between her and the reality around her, and instead of feeling exposed, she felt clearer. "Keep moving," she said, and the group advanced, not faster, not slower, just steady, each step intentional, each adjustment immediate. The storm did not lessen, the heat did not drop, the conditions remained exactly as they were, but their response had changed entirely, and that change altered everything. Lyra lifted her eyes again and realized they were close now. Close enough to see the details of Ethan's face, the calm in his expression, the absence of strain, not because the environment did not affect him, but because he did not rely on anything that could fail. She stopped a few feet away, the group forming behind her, no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, just present. The wind moved around them, no longer pushing them apart, but flowing past as if they had become part of it. Ethan looked at her for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just acknowledging, and in that silence, Lyra understood something she could not quantify. The lesson had never been about surviving the environment. It had been about removing everything that made survival conditional, and for the first time, standing there without the system, without guarantees, she did not feel unprotected. She felt capable. The wind shifted without warning, not stronger, not louder, but different, the kind of change that did not announce itself with alarms or indicators, only with consequence. Lyra felt it first along the edge of her balance, a subtle pull that did not match the pattern she had learned. Her next step landed slightly off, the sand beneath her giving way more than expected. Her body corrected instantly, but the correction cost energy, and energy was no longer something she could ignore. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the steady rhythm they had built. The group halted, not in panic, but in awareness, each of them holding position, feeling the shift rather than reacting to it blindly. Lyra lifted her gaze, scanning the horizon. The storm above them looked the same layers of moving air, the same distortion of heat, but the ground told a different story. The texture had changed, finer, looser, less stable. She crouched slightly, pressing her hand against the surface. The grain slid too easily, offering no resistance. "The ground is changing," she said, more to herself than to them. "Adjust weight distribution, slower steps." One of the students nodded, already shifting his stance, spreading his weight more evenly, testing before committing. The others followed, their movements becoming even more deliberate, even more controlled. Ethan watched from a few feet away, his posture unchanged, but his attention sharper now, not guiding, not interrupting, just present. As the environment introduced a new variable, Lyra took a step forward, slower than before, her foot sinking slightly before stabilizing. She adjusted, leaning back just enough to maintain balance. The wind pushed again, not harder, but at a different angle, and this time she anticipated it, shifting her center before it could move her. The difference was immediate. No stumble, no correction needed, just flow. "Do not fight it," she said quietly. "Let it move around you." The group mirrored her, their formation tightening slightly, not out of fear, but efficiency. Each person adjusting in relation to the others, maintaining spacing without needing to be told. The system remained silent. No warnings, no corrections, no reassurance. And in that silence, Lyra realized something else. The environment was not becoming more dangerous. It was becoming more honest, removing the illusions they had relied on, forcing them to see what was always there. She glanced at Ethan, meeting his eyes for the first time without hesitation. "You knew this would happen," she said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating. He gave a small nod, barely noticeable. "It always does," he replied, and there was no pride in his voice, no satisfaction, just fact. Lyra looked back at the ground, at the shifting sand that no system had warned them about in time, and understood that the lesson was not escalating. It was revealing, layer by layer, removing assumptions until only reality remained. She took another step, then another, each one measured, each one chosen. The instability still there, but no longer unexpected. Behind her the others moved in sync, not perfectly, but together, and for the first time since the environment had begun to change, there was no hesitation in their movement, no search for guidance, only action informed by awareness. Lyra exhaled slowly, the air still thin, the heat still pressing, the wind still shifting, but none of it felt overwhelming anymore, because it was no longer unknown. And as they moved forward across ground that refused to stay still, she realized that the real danger had never been the environment. It had been the assumption that it would behave the way they expected. The change did not announce itself with sound or motion. It arrived as absence. The wind that had pressed against them for so long suddenly thinned. Not gone, but reduced to a faint current that barely touched their suits. Lyra slowed without needing to be told, her body recognizing the shift before her thoughts could define it. The resistance that had guided every step was no longer there, and with it, the rhythm they had built began to falter. One of the students took a step too quickly, overcompensating for a force that no longer existed. His footing slipped on the unstable surface, not enough to fall, but enough to break the pattern. "Hold," Lyra said immediately, raising her hand. The group stopped again, this time not because of pressure, but because of its absence. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm had. Their breathing filled the calms, louder now without the wind to mask it, uneven again, searching for a pace that no longer had external guidance. Lyra lifted her gaze, the horizon clearer now, the distortion reduced, revealing more detail than before, distant structures, jagged outlines of something artificial embedded in the desert, barely visible through the thinning haze. She had not noticed them earlier, not because they were hidden, but because the storm had demanded all attention. "The environment is changing again," she said, her voice quieter, more focused. "Do not assume stability." She took a step forward, slower than before, testing not for resistance, but for absence. Her foot landed firmly, no shifting, no sliding. The ground here was different, compact, almost solid, but she did not trust it. Not yet. She shifted her weight gradually, confirming what her senses suggested, then moved again. The others followed, but their movements were less certain now, the lack of pressure making each step feel unanchored. Lyra felt it too, the strange disorientation of having nothing push back, nothing to measure against. "Adjust internally," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Do not rely on the environment to guide you." The statement sounded simple, but the execution was not. Without the wind, without the shifting sand, there was nothing external to react to. Only internal control remained, posture, balance, breath, awareness. Ethan stepped forward for the first time since they had reached him, closing the remaining distance with quiet ease, his movements unchanged despite the shift, as if the environment had never dictated them to begin with. He stopped beside Lyra, not in front of her, not leading, just present. "What changed?" he asked, his voice calm, but direct. Lyra did not answer immediately. She observed, felt, processed the absence of force, the stability of the ground, the clarity of the air, and then she spoke. "There is no external pressure," she said, "no resistance to define movement." Ethan nodded slightly. "And," he prompted. Lyra took a breath, steady, controlled. "Without it, we lose reference," she finished, the realization settling into place with quiet certainty. Ethan looked at the group, then back at her. "So what do you use?" he asked. "Not as a test, but as a continuation." Lyra straightened slightly, her posture aligning without effort, her breathing steady without guidance, her awareness focused without distraction. "Ourselves," she said, and this time the word carried no uncertainty, only understanding. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind that did not reward, but acknowledged. And as the group stood in the stillness of an environment that no longer pushed them in any direction, Lyra realized that the lesson had reached its quietest point, not in chaos, not in pressure, but in the absence of both, where nothing forced a decision, and everything depended on the one making it. The silence held longer than expected, not empty, but complete. Lyra stood there with the others, no alarms, no warnings, no system prompts trying to define what came next. Just the steady rhythm of controlled breathing and the faint hum of their own suits operating at the edge of function. The horizon stretched wide and clear now, the distant structures no longer hidden by distortion. Angular shapes of alloy and glass rising from the desert like something forgotten. Ethan turned slightly toward them, not to lead, but to observe. "Walk," he said, and that was all. No direction, no parameters, no guidance beyond a single word. Lyra did not hesitate this time. She stepped forward, not testing, not reacting, simply choosing a direction and committing to it. Her movement steady, balanced, defined entirely by her own control. The others followed without question, forming behind her in a quiet line that no longer needed instruction. Each step carried intention. Each adjustment came from awareness rather than correction. The ground beneath them remained stable, but they did not trust it blindly. Their weight shifted with care, their pace consistent without external pressure to shape it. Ethan walked beside them now, not ahead, not behind, matching their speed without effort. His presence no longer something distant to observe, but something understood without explanation. "What did you lose?" he asked after a few moments, his voice calm, almost quiet against the still air. Lyra considered the question, not rushing to answer. She reviewed everything that had changed, the systems that failed, the boundaries that meant nothing, the patterns that dissolved. "Certainty," she said finally, her voice steady. Ethan nodded once, then asked, "And what did you gain?" This time the answer came faster, not because it was simpler, but because it was already there. "Awareness," she said, and as the words settled, she realized it was more than that. It was presence, control, responsibility without reliance. Ethan glanced at her, then at the others. "That is the difference," he said. "Systems give you certainty, but certainty can fail." He let the words hang for a moment, not as a lesson, but as a fact. "Awareness does not promise safety," he continued. "It gives you a chance." They walked in silence after that, the kind that did not need to be filled, the environment around them no longer hostile, no longer protective, simply real. Lyra looked ahead at the distant structures, then back at the path they had crossed, the storm that had stripped away everything they depended on, the stillness that had left them with nothing but themselves. And for the first time, she understood why the human had never needed to change his pace, never needed to adjust to the system, because he had never relied on it to begin with. They reached the edge of the simulation boundary without noticing it. No line, no shift, just a gradual return of controlled parameters, temperature stabilizing, oxygen levels rising, systems reconnecting with quiet efficiency. The displays flickered back to life, offering perfect data once again, but no one looked at them. Not immediately. Lyra slowed, then stopped, the others doing the same. the silence returning one last time. She turned slightly toward Ethan, her expression calm, but changed. "This was not a safety lesson," she said, not as a question, but as understanding. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unchanged. "No," he said. "It was the absence of one." Lyra looked down at her reactivated display, the numbers precise, reliable, complete, and for a moment, she considered turning it off again, not because it was useless, but because she no longer needed it to define her. She lifted her gaze back to the horizon, the desert still stretching beyond the controlled environment, unchanged by what they had learned, and in that quiet space between system and self, she understood something that no data could measure. Humans were not safe because their world was easier. They were ready because it was not, and that difference changed everything.